Welcome, everyone. We are going to start, before we get into the more heavy material, with just taking a few minutes and noticing our bodies, trying to get out of our heads a little bit, maybe letting go of all of the things you've done today, which I have no doubt have been plentiful. So just taking a moment, maybe taking a couple of comfortable breaths, noticing your body sitting in your chair. Maybe noticing points of contact that your body's making with surfaces. So your feet on the ground, and the backs of your legs on the chair. Having your spine relatively straight without being stiff. And shoulders down and head above shoulders. If you'd like to close your eyes, feel free to do that. If you prefer to keep them open, that's completely fine too. And just breathing in, knowing that you're breathing in, and breathing out, knowing that you're breathing out. And just taking a couple of breaths here at a pace that feels comfortable for you. And if it feels good to you, perhaps saying to yourself, breathing in, I calm my body, and breathing out, I calm my mind. And taking a couple more breaths. We'd like to start with these grounding practices, especially at a time when we're talking about grief, and maybe things will come up that you might notice in your body. You're feeling some tension, some discomfort, knowing that you could come back to this. This is here for you at any time. If you're just feeling like you need to care for yourself and bring yourself to the present moment. So thanks again, everyone, for being here and taking the time to discuss grief with us, and specifically discuss this particular model of being with grief and integrating grief. So this first part that we're going to go through is just a little bit of foundational information that we've discussed and we think is important to know about grief, especially when you're working in an environment where there is different types of loss and death, just to be aware of some of what we've learned in the research and the literature, how grief may show up and how it may impact us. So the first thing I want to say, that grief is completely natural. It's a completely normal and expected response when we experience difficult things. So we could grieve in many different types of situations. It could be the loss of independence. It could be the loss of predictability. And again, it could be around things like illness and dying. So we really do expect that grief will show up for both you as team members in long-term care, the individuals who are living long-term care homes, and the families and care partners that are surrounding them. So when I talk about grief, I don't think of grief itself as one particular emotion. I really think about grief as a broad experience that impacts us in so many different ways. So it can impact us physically. We might notice that we're carrying aches and pains and discomfort when we're going through a grieving experience. We might notice cognitively that we're feeling fuzzy-headed or can't concentrate, difficulties processing things. We might notice emotionally that we have things that are coming up. It could be regret, it could be sadness, it could be frustration or anger. And we might notice just our behaviors and patterns have changed. It could impact the way we eat, the way we sleep, the way we feel being around people. So grief really does impact us in a variety of ways. And while there's a lot of crossover, if you're in a room with people discussing grief, I think a lot of the similar experiences will come up. But I also think that grief is really individual. Every experience that a person goes through has its own characteristics. So we can't really, the experience is not transferable from one person to another. You can't say, oh, this is what I experienced when I was grieving, so I know exactly what you're feeling, because that's not usually the case. Everybody has their own experience when they're grieving. And then another thing I think is important to mention is really how tiring, how much energy it requires to grieve. So I always, when I'm supporting people who are who are experiencing grief, I always remind them, less is more. Lower the expectations you place on yourself. When you're experiencing grief, you can feel very emotionally exhausted, physically exhausted. So just be gentle and good to yourself. I wanted to share this with you. This is a one-page information sheet that we created, the Champlain Hospice Palliative Care Program where I work. We put this together. This was specifically done during COVID. And I think like at the height of COVID, I think we've adapted it a little bit because some of the COVID specific information isn't necessarily available anymore. Although in this one, I see it's still there, the COVID-19 therapists, which I don't think are reachable, but we do have a version that's been updated if this is something that you think would be useful for the team members or families that are connected to your long-term care home. So it's just a resource that normalizes grief, shares a little bit about what people might be experiencing, ways of supporting people, and some contact numbers locally in the Champlain area that people could connect with if they need some extra support around grief. So I like this visual. I've seen different ones on the internet. There are a few that I play around with, but this one is simple, and I think it really articulates what a lot of people are feeling. On the left-hand side, how we want grief to work. We would like for it to be a straight line. We would like it to be predictable. We start at point A and we go to point Z or B, however it is. But, that the sense that if we knew what to expect, it would be a lot easier, right? We could just work our way through it and know. And that kind of goes back to the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages of grief that I think many of us have heard about over our lifetimes. That we have these distinct stages, and Kubler-Ross's work was fantastic, but it was kind of misconstrued along the way. Her stages of grief were really meant to talk about people who are experiencing illness, the grief that they themselves were feeling, but it's kind of been looked at more broadly as, when people are grieving, they go through these specific stages, but we know that that's not true. We don't have set stages of grief. We don't pass through them in a linear fashion. Really, grief looks a lot more like the messy ball on the right-hand side. And I think what's helpful about this and thinking about it in this way is that if we expect things to be messy, when they are, we can manage them a lot better, right? We don't feel like we're doing something wrong, that we're not grieving properly. If we have this expectation that grief is unpredictable, it could be all over the place. We could be having a good day, a good week, and then things might fall apart, and that's okay. Then it's a lot easier to deal with that when it happens. In the grief literature, they talk a lot about grief bursts, which I think is a great term. So we could have these days or these weeks or months again where, we feel like, okay, like I'm integrating grief, I'm kind of doing all right. And then suddenly we're just whacked with this huge grief burst that feels completely overwhelming in the moment. So again, just expecting that these things might happen and taking care of ourselves when they do. One particular type of grief that I thought I would share today is disenfranchised grief, because it's when I'm working with my colleagues in long-term care, which is where I've been spending a lot of my time the last couple of years. My job really is working across sectors, but I have been spending a lot of time in long-term care the last 2 years, and I've been loving working with the teams that I get to work with. But I'm hearing this experience come up of disenfranchised grief, which is really when there's a failure of others to recognize the grief that long-term care team members, or anyone, but in this case, long-term care team members are experiencing. And when that grief is not recognized, individuals end up feeling that like they're not seen for the experience they have. So I'm hearing from, again, some of my colleagues in long-term care that when that does come up and there's no opportunity to be with it, to talk about it, to have it normalized by other team members, that they feel that that's something's wrong with them. They have wondered, people have shared with me that they've wondered, why do I feel this way? What's wrong with me? I chose this work. I'm not entitled to be feeling grief. I need to be more professional. So all of these different things come up that contribute to grief being disenfranchised. So we're going to talk a lot this evening as we go on about how we could bring grief to the forefront in homes so that this doesn't happen. So some of the research is showing us that if we don't attend to disenfranchised grief, if we don't recognize it, if we don't name it, if we don't discuss it, what might happen with the team members in homes is that they have a variety of uncomfortable and difficult experiences. And those could be things like intrusive thoughts, like things keep playing over in their minds, parts of an experience, parts of a death could really be, repeating in your minds, including things like nightmares and, they just interfere. Some of these ideas and thoughts are interfering with your daily ability to do your jobs. There's also potentially a sense of just being detached, feeling like you can't connect with your coworkers and with the people you're supporting. So you're feeling separate from people. You're not really feeling that connection. There might be some burnout. And we also know when there's disenfranchised grief, there's an increase in depression and anxiety. So we really want to work hard for grief not to become disenfranchised. We want to make sure that people are being seen when they're experiencing grief. So I'm going to pass things over to Mary Lou now.
Great. Thanks, Tara. That was terrific. And, now that Tara has given you the overview of the experience and impact of grief in long-term care, I'm just going to share a little bit of information with you from my own work about how long-term care home providers talk about grief. So I'm a social worker by profession, but retired as a researcher. I did research and taught at Lakehead University. And this research was actually done about 10 years ago. I'll be interested, shortly we're going to do a poll to see whether you can still really identify with some of the things that I heard when I was in the long-term care homes. So these two quotes, "Death is part of the job," and "It's hard to watch people die for a living." Those are two very, very powerful expressions of how integrated the end-of-life experience is to the day-to-day work of long-term care home providers. These were things that people told me. So next slide, Carl. So what we did is we went out and talked to long-term care home providers to understand their experiences of grief and to get their perceptions of how long-term care homes could better support their staff. We interviewed RNs, RPNs, and PSWs. And 4 overall themes from the kinds of things they said emerged. And you'll see them here on the screen. They talked a lot about how the organizational context of working in a long-term care home influences their grief and loss, the burden of the grief that they carry, because as the previous quote indicated, death is just part of the job. The emotional impact of the grief on them, emotionally, physically, and Tara has already given you some excellent information about that. And then they gave us some suggestions for how long-term care homes might better respond to them. So I'm going to give you just a little bit more elaboration on each of those. So in terms of the organizational context of grief and long-term care, they told me that they found that death was hidden, kind of whisked under the carpet. It wasn't talked about very openly. Residents, would often ask, where did Mary Lou go? And there was kind of like a collective shrug. Not so much because they didn't know, but they didn't feel comfortable or didn't even know that they were allowed to talk about it. Some of the homes talked about how when the individual had died in the home and the body was being removed, it was being removed out the back door, you know, out of sight of the rest of the residents and the staff. They also said that in the long-term care home, they had no training to prepare staff for loss. They did a lot of staff development, but none of it had anything to do with preparing them for grief. And they said death is part of the job, and that there's really this silent culture that exists around dying. Nobody really talks about it. So let's see. Just gonna move on here. Excuse me. You want to give me the next slide, Carl, please? Yeah, so we're going to do a Zoom poll, and those are the 4 themes that I discussed with you. And in the poll, Carl's going to invite you to indicate whether you feel that these themes are still part of your experience in long-term care. And we're just going to have a general sense of prevalence. It's all anonymous.
And you can choose all of the ones that apply. So you can choose more than one if that's applicable. Looks like most people have answered now, but I'm just going to give it a couple more moments here still. Okay. So I'll share the results here. Can you see that, Mary Lou?
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, we could. So it looks like we had 80% of people, if we start with the most people who agreed with the statement, 80% said there is no training to prepare staff for loss. And 77% said death is part of the job. 69% said there is a silent culture that exists around dying. And much lower than the others, 34% said death is hidden.
Yeah. So thanks for that. Thanks for sharing. And, you know, some of the things that I know have changed in long-term care is different, more images that will help indicate the respect and recognition for the death, like the dignity quilt and marching the body out and that sort of thing. Carl, we'll go to the next slide. So we asked staff to give us their suggestions for how long-term care homes might better support them. And the first thing they did talk about was the importance of organizational support for staff. They wanted formal support, and they wanted staff debriefing after a difficult death of multiple losses. And the model that Tara is going to share with you and Valerie's going to describe her experience with using is the model we actually developed in our research with the long-term care staff for staff debriefing. It's called the INNPUTT model. They also wanted organizational recognition of the resident's death to support the staff grief. And it sounds like, based on what you're saying, that death is not hidden to the extent that it was when we first did this research 10 years ago. And that's a really terrific thing. They wanted notification of the resident's death because they found that often, partly because there wasn't much recognition of the death, staff would come to work and they wouldn't even necessarily even know that a resident had died. They were wanting a service of celebration in recognition of resident's death and a memory board or some kind of memory tree. So I'll invite you as we go along here to write in the chat if some of these things I'm mentioning are happening in your homes, and also if there are other things that your organization is doing to support. The other second topic was they wanted educational support. And they really felt strongly that it was important that during their orientation, it was talked about that death would be part of the job and that there would be grief and loss that they would have to support other residents with and deal with on their own. And they wanted access to more information for families on grief and bereavement. So we did a lot of work in creating resources that they could use, just similar to the resource that Tara showed you that they have done such an excellent job creating with the Champlain Palliative Care Program. And then informal peer support. One of the things that staff said was most effective for them was having a chance to share and support each other. They would talk about the loss, they would use humor, but the ability for the peer group, and the PSWs talked about this the most, was very, very important. And they wanted opportunities to support each other. They wanted peer guiding peer through the grief process so that some of the older PSWs who had a lot of experience and were really comfortable, they really needed and wanted to take the newbies under their wing and really kind of show them the ropes, because it's one thing to talk about it, and it's another thing to actually live through it. They wanted rituals established when resident died. And you may have examples of some rituals. Some of them might be religious, but many of them were just, could be cultural or, just some kind of recognition. And then supporting residents and families was also viewed as very important. So I think that's my last slide, Carl, and I see there's quite a lot of energy going into the chat, so that's really, really exciting. And should we be reading these out, do you think,
so I think what we'll probably do at this point, Mary Lou, is let's head to the chat box. We'll work through some of the questions and comments in the chat box, and then we're going to invite people to raise their hand and ask questions. So if you want to take these next few minutes and think if you are one of those people who would like to unmute yourself or put on your video and ask us a question, we'd be happy to answer. But first we'll go to the chat box. So a little ways back, there was a question: what can I say to my colleagues when I'm grieving about a resident? It can be hard to know what to say with disenfranchised grief. So yeah, so I appreciate that, right? And so what I'm hearing is that when you yourself are experiencing grief after the death of a resident, how can you go to a colleague and talk to them about it? And what I would say is, first, our hope is that in having these conversations, your home is starting to build a culture where it's okay to talk about grief, because I think that's the first step, right? It has to sort of come out of the shadows and be accepted, and everyone has this understanding that it's important to have conversations about grieving. The second thing I would say is, either on your own or as a team, starting to work on how you ask for help. right? I think it's something a lot of people struggle with, but finding the words to say, you know, when Mary died, that was really difficult for me. Would you be willing to sit with me and have a conversation? Or are you in a space? Are you able to be with me to talk? Or I'm struggling since Mary died. Would you have time, or would you be able to go for a walk with me? So just opening those doors, right? And it's that question makes me think a little bit about 6 or 7 years ago, I guess 6 years ago, when we were doing a lot of this work in person with different healthcare teams and sort of opening these conversations about grief in different healthcare environments. But I was working with a colleague, Pam Grassa, who's a social work professor at Carleton now. And we used to ask people to go to different parts of the room, depending on what they needed when they were experiencing grief. So we would say, if you're the type of person who needs to talk to a friend, can you stand over there? And if you're a type of person who needs to be alone, go stand in this corner. And if you need to be physical, or if you need to be creative, or if there's something else, or if you're in between, find a spot in the middle. And it was really interesting to see, right, where team members went. And just to get a sense, one, that we don't all grieve in the same way. Two, for teams that were close and knew each other, they would start to see what their colleagues needed, right? So it gave them an opportunity to sort of know what might feel supportive to the people that they work closely with. So I really enjoy doing that. And I hope that sort of was a little bit helpful. For me, one, it's the culture, two, it's the language, and three is really just being prepared to reach out, because you're not alone, right? And that's a lot about what this, a lot of what we're talking about tonight is that you are not alone in experiencing grief when a person you're supporting dies. So, ideally, these conversations, sessions like tonight, begin to stimulate conversation in your home if that's not happening yet. So there was a question, what is a dignity quilt? Mary Lou,
yeah, well, I can answer, but Val, you were working in the long-term care home that had the dignity quilt. So why don't you take that one on?
Sure. Thanks, Mary Lou. And I know it was somebody did comment as well in the chat as to the dignity quilt. So what it is a way to honor a resident when they have died, to honor them, to recognize, and to provide that comforting send off as they are exiting the building. And so often the dignity quilt that we had in our homes were actually created by the Thunder Bay Quilters Guild and donated to the long-term care homes. And they would be draped over the body of the resident as they are being escorted, typically by frontline staff, that we would provide an escort as they were exited from the building. And as practices were changing, that it was in honor of and recognition of the resident.
Thank you, Val. So there's another question or a comment here. Rosemary has shared, for me, it's part of the job. So death is part of the job. But when COVID came, it was really different when the funeral home wasn't allowed to come into the home. So they would send a bag for the staff to put the body in. And that really hit me. So yeah, so thank you, Rosemary, for sharing that, right? And
Tara, I would just like to kind of make a comment to Rose, and I really get it, how hard that would be. And I think the thing that's often not appreciated, and that I learned from the long-term care home staff that I worked with, is how emotionally attached they became to the residents that they essentially lived with on a day-to-day basis during their work life. And while certainly they aren't biological family, their relationships were very, very close. And they described them to me often as family-like in many cases, which of course contributes to that really profound sense of grief that staff feel when residents die. But it also speaks to Rosemary, your comment, because I don't think they expect the family to put the body in a body bag, you know, and yet there's a lack of appreciation that, you know, those really strong emotional ties that long-term care home staff develop over months and in some cases years, make that just a really tough ask. And I think it's an example of disenfranchised grief because the long-term care home just may not be sensitive to the fact that it's one thing for them to do it. They're not dealing with essentially someone that they've really been close to and attached to when they're doing it.
Thanks, Mary Lou. Yeah, and I really appreciate that and calling it out as an experience of disenfranchised grief, right? And when I think about how can we support you having been through that experience, what I would hope is that being able to share how challenging that was, and having other people who may have had a similar experience, or even people who haven't, just acknowledge that. Yeah, that must have been really tough. Right, for all the reasons that Mary Lou mentioned, like extremely difficult. And I'm thinking about yesterday, I was at a home here in the Champlain area, working with a long-term care home team around palliative approach to care. And at the beginning, when I asked, what brings you to work, you know, and there were team members that had been there 1 year all the way up to over 35 years. And every single person in the room said, it's the relationships, right? So just reinforcing what you said, Mary Lou, like people are there for the relationships. They feel so connected to the people living in the home, to the families, to their coworkers. But yeah, deeply relational. And I can't imagine how difficult that must be, right? To take on a task like that you've never been prepared for when you're grieving yourself. So thank you for sharing that, Rosemary. We appreciate it. There are some other comments. I think these are relating more, Mary Lou, to the question, what sorts of things have you implemented in your homes?
That's right.
Yeah, so there's a comment that from Gail. She said, we do an annual memorial service remembering all residents who died during the year, light a candle for each and read a memory about each resident who died. The service is attended by staff and family members. There is a comment from Jennifer. At work, they place a candle on the table where the resident used to sit, so residents and staff know the person has passed away. She also mentioned when they are taking out a person's body, they line up. So I've heard that called the honor guard. They line up to say goodbye. And sorry, I'm just scrolling through the chat box. A similar comment from Jeanette. We line up when a resident is exiting the home. We have a dignity quilt as well. And then Valerie has shared with us, I was struck by the numbers of people that said they haven't had any education related to grief. What do folks think would be helpful? So I think that question, Val, correct me if I'm wrong, but what kind of education would be helpful? Is that where, or did they indicate what kind of education would be helpful, Mary Lou?
Well, there's nothing in the chat. Oh, you're asking me.
So I think Val's asking if they indicated what sort of education would be
they
helpful.
certainly wanted something at orientation about grief, but let me just consult my notes here. We provided them, I can tell you what we did. We provided them with pamphlets and brochures from our palliative care regional program. I was not living in the Ottawa area, so the comparable to Tara and Carl. about the experience of grief, the impact of grief. We left them right in the long-term care homes for not only for staff, but also for staff to have good access to share with the families and to go through them with families. We provided them with a course called Palliative Care for Frontline Workers. And it really wasn't a clinical course as much as a psychosocial course, really helping them become more comfortable with the whole idea that death is part of the job, and things about how they could better support each other. And I know that similar opportunities are probably available in the Ottawa area. I'm new to Ottawa, so I'm not exactly sure
Yeah,
about
thanks,
all the
Mary Lou.
details.
Yeah, and I could add to that a little bit. Val's asking. Val is mine and Carl's boss. She's the executive director at the Champlain Hospice Palliative Care Program. So she's asking if we could wave a wand and offer more education. What would that education look like? So I could share just a little bit what I've learned from being out in long-term care homes, what kind of education either, I've heard in addition to what we're already offering. Sometimes ideas come up that we haven't really pursued that I'm hearing people like. So I think one of the things I've heard most often, and I would love feedback from this group if you're interested in giving some feedback, is an idea I learned about. I was taking a course at the University of Toronto called Mindfulness Informed End-of-Life Care. And that was with Michelle Chaban. She's a thanatologist and has worked in palliative care for many, many years. And this program is part of sort of a legacy program that she's created. And she had a beautiful exercise based on the work of a man named Robert Kastenbaum, where he says that we all have a death thought system. So he explains that our death thought systems are things that we developed early in our life, usually around our first experience of dying and death. So that could be the death of a pet. It could be the death of an extended family member. It could be the death of somebody close to us. And in that experience, usually as young people, we look to the adults around us to sort of guide us in how to, how to behave, how to process, how to be with dying and grief. So he would say that there are explicit messages that we get from adults, things that were told to us directly. Don't cry, don't be loud, don't interrupt, don't be in the way. So very explicit things that were said, but there are also implicit things that we just notice and things that we observe. And those things become really part of an ingrained belief system about how we are when we're grieving, right? Or how we are after a death. So what I found interesting about talking to team members in long-term care is when I bring up this idea just as a concept, everyone's like, oh yeah, never really thought about it. I have all these things that I think are true and I share them with people, but they may or may not agree. And it's kind of like this aha moment, right? That we're bringing all of these ideas into a place where dying happens. And if we're not really keenly, mindfully aware that we have these ideas, we could unintentionally, put them on other people or, not be aware that other people feel differently. So I think this is a piece of education. I'm curious if that interests you, if it's something you think would be useful in your home, is this idea of exploring what your death thought system is, and if that would help you sort of be with your grief after a resident dies and be able to support yourself and support your colleagues in a better way. So just put that out there. Feel free to share back if you think that would be helpful or something you'd be interested in. So I think now we're going to go to questions. So if there are any other questions that haven't been put in the chat box, if there's anyone who feels like unmuting themselves, please feel free to raise your hand. Carl will call on you and you can turn on your camera and we're happy to answer stuff.
Yeah, so just there's a little hand there in the bottom of Zoom. If you scroll your mouse down there, if you're on your phone, it'll just be in the bottom centered there. That's kind of like the raise hand function. So if you press that, then we'll unmute you. Or if you're having trouble finding that, just write it in the chat that you want to ask your question with audio or your comments. But I'm not seeing any right now, Tara, so maybe we'll circle back to it.
Fair enough. So that sounds good. If you feel like it at some point, just feel free to raise your hand and we will come back. So I see there's one other comment or question in the chat box. Carolyn is asking, is there an institutional culture that encourages staff to seek help when they are grieving after a resident's death, or often after several deaths or residents that they were close to? So yeah, Carolyn, I think, you know, that's our hope, right? The institutional culture. We talk a lot about culture change. I think that's, you know, a term that we use quite a bit in long-term care, maybe other sectors too, that we're looking for. You know, our hope is that that is happening. And I think so. If we answer the question, is there an institutional culture? I would say yes, it probably exists along a spectrum in the homes that I support. Mary Lou, I'm curious.
I would be curious to know if anybody online. What I was trying to promote in the work that I did was have grief support included in their workplace wellness program. I mean, the workplace wellness program was all about, you know, and importantly too, not hurting your back, not tripping on something. But I said, what about grief? And I mean, the immediate reaction I got at the time was like, what are you talking about? And in a certain way, because death is part of the job, and there's this notion that if you are professional, you won't be too emotional, which in fact would result in you not being good at your job. I mean, the best staff are the ones that emotionally connect with their residents, and that's what makes them vulnerable. So it really didn't get into the workplace wellness program. And on an institutional level, I think that's a really important thing. And I would be very curious to know if it's in there now.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was curious about your experience 10 years ago. And I would say my experience in the last 5 years, including yesterday, again, is that like homes are in very different places. And what came up just yesterday too is really like team members that are just coming out of school are still hearing things in some of their programs. I can't speak broadly. This is just, you know, one group I was supporting, but they're still hearing in school, don't get too close, right? Keep your professional distance. So, you know, my response to that is how you all just finished telling me that you're deeply relational. The reason you do this work is because you care for people and you love people. So it seems completely contrary, right? How can you want to do this work and continue to do this work because you're deeply relational, yet keep your distance from people? It doesn't make sense. So yeah, so I think a bunch of things, right? If people are coming to, you know, their workplaces with this idea that I'm supposed to try to keep my distance, but I'm struggling to keep my distance and I am feeling grief, but I don't know if I'm supposed to say anything. It really does become extremely important. And I would say the responsibility, you know, more and more as grief is becoming discussed more openly, of homes to start to look for solutions to implement. And I would say, like, I've been really pleasantly surprised in the last 5 years or so that I've been doing this work, that I have been invited into homes to do debriefing. You'll see as we start to talk about the INNPUT model, some of the places that, you know, I've been able to pick up on the work that Val and Mary Lou did and share this peer debriefing model with homes. So I am seeing that there are organizations and environments where it is very important, right, to create a culture that is grief friendly.
And sometimes the home will have a social worker on staff or a spiritual care worker on staff who actually spends a lot of time supporting the staff as opposed to the residents, which I think is perfectly appropriate, because it's all part of the team and making the team function, you know, effectively together. And, you know, as we, you know, we talk about the language, but I mean, when you were in the kind of work that long-term care home providers are in, where death is part of the job, you can't detach and be effective, in my opinion. But you do need to learn to manage it. Now, Val, I'm going to ask you, as someone who was an outstanding long-term care home nurse for many, many years, what are your thoughts on that?
So in particular with regards to,
Well, just managing grief and how the organization can promote wellness or acknowledge the need for wellness with the staff. I mean, do you get bereavement leave? I don't think so.
So depending on organizations, what they might get bereavement leave for, right? But I agree with what you guys are saying. We are the wonderful beings that we are in working with healthcare and in long-term care and healthcare settings for the compassionate people that we are. And maintaining our professionalism, I think, is important, but to say that we don't get attached is not who we are. So I think realizing and recognizing how to maintain our professionalism while grieving and while caring for residents, supporting families, as well as supporting one another and individuals. It's okay to cry. Right. We, as Mary Lou had mentioned, that we develop those strong, close relationships with the residents and family. They're family-like, and it's just how to conduct ourselves professionally, but also compassionately and caring and supporting one another in our work every day. And for, again, organizations to recognize that and provide the opportunities for staff and grief support, and for supporting models like the INNPUT model for addressing and supporting staff grief. So important.
Yeah. Thank you, Val. Yeah, it's great to hear that. So if we're ready to sort of move forward, there don't seem to be any other comments or questions at this time. So I appreciate you sort of moving us towards the INNPUT model again, going back to a way that we can continue, that we could support teams, that teams could support one another, right? Because this is a really important aspect, that there's capacity within the home, that people feel that within the team that they could come together and support one another. So this, we're going to just go back talking a little bit about general benefits of debriefing, and then we're going to move specifically into the INNPUT model. So again, we know that the benefits of debriefing are things like the occurrence of disenfranchised grief is reduced, it's minimized if we have the opportunities, if the opportunities exist, to come together and discuss what has happened and how people are doing. Debriefing also leads to reduced stress and absenteeism of team members and overall workplace wellness, which are all things that contribute to just a healthier culture that is grief friendly and better for everyone. So I like this little image. Self-care is not selfish. You cannot serve from an empty vessel. I think it's always an important reminder. The healthcare workers that I work with are really good at continuing to care and give and more, and always looking to support the people they care for. But I think there are never too many opportunities to remind people that you got to look after yourself first, and finding ways that you're able to care for yourself, especially when you're experiencing grief. I wanted to share with you just a few groups and organizations that have been introduced to the INNPUT model, which is where we're headed. So here in the Champlain area, the Regional Palliative Consultation Team in Ontario, more broadly, the Palliative Care Consultants Network, the Champlain Centre for Healthcare Ethics, a variety of long-term care homes and group homes here in the region, and participants of our program, the Champlain Hospice Palliative Care Program, our education day that we run annually, have also been exposed. to the input model. So we thank you, Mary Lou and Valerie, for working with homes to create this model. Because, I know it's been 10 years, but I think the people that I've been sharing it with and have been practicing with it and using it are finding it really valuable. So it's a great resource that I'm excited to share with the group today. So this is a one-pager that we created, and you'll see the reference to the original toolkit, where you'll find much more robust information. But this is an overview. We're going to spend probably just 10 or 15 minutes going through the 6 different steps of the input model. And then I hope, Valerie, that's enough time for you. Okay, just making sure. So again, this is one page handout that we are happy to share with anybody if you are interested. And these are the 6 steps of the input model. So there's an introduction, need to say, need to do, plan, understanding, and thank you. So we will break them down and go through them. But before we get to that, just a couple of things that would be important for the peer facilitator to know before starting the debriefing circle. So I guess I'm going to start by saying, ideally, the debriefing lasts about 20 minutes. So it's meant to be something that is accessible. We know that time is always an issue in long-term care. So it's meant to provide an opportunity for people to be able to acknowledge and share what's happening for them without taking up too much time, and so that people just have this opportunity. But because if it was really, really long, we know it would be hard to incorporate. So about 20 minutes. Again, it's a peer-led debriefing model. So there could be a variety of people in the homes. It doesn't have to be one person who's always leading the peer debriefing. When I've shared it in a variety of settings, there are usually multiple people who feel, oh, this is something I could do. So I really encourage you, if you're working with this at your home, to identify several people who are interested in taking turns and trying to be the facilitator. So before the debriefing takes place, the facilitator might want to be aware of certain things. Ideally, they'll have a sense of some of the details that were surrounding the death of the individual. They might want to have a sense of the people that are coming to the debriefing. If possible, they might want to have some information, the people participating, what experiences they may have had, if there have been some really difficult deaths previously, and any particular areas of concern for the participants. So just a little bit to be able to help sort of manage the process of the debriefing as it goes. So the more prepared the facilitator is, can contribute to it going a little more smoothly. At the same time, if the facilitator doesn't have that information, that's okay too, right? Sometimes if there are a few people who are comfortable being a facilitator, that really helps, because if one person is kind of leading it, but there are maybe team members that are struggling, another peer facilitator might be able to support them, if they need to walk away or need a little extra care. So not having information is not a reason to not do the debriefing. It's just a suggestion that it might make it a little bit easier. Here are some of the guidelines for the actual debriefing. And again, these are just guidelines. They don't have to be exactly as they're listed here, but some ideas for consideration. So first, no one in the circle, in the sharing circle or the debriefing circle, is forced to talk. They're able to do so if they want, but they could also just be there to listen and participate in that way. Frontline staff ideally are encouraged to come from beginning to end. It's 20 minutes, so hopefully everybody could be there for the duration. It's less disruptive. People will get more out of it if they could stay for the entire time. Everyone in the circle, everyone on the team, regardless of how long they've been at the home and what the role is in the home, everyone is treated equally. There are no right or wrong answers. There's no right or wrong in terms of people's experiences and what's happening for them. Ideally, there are no interruptions. So cell phones, etc. Hopefully those could be put away. Differences in opinion are expected and they are valued, right? So this is, and I think especially these days when we talk a lot about cultural humility, wondering what other people have learned. So if I go back to the death thought system, just this recognition that we are different and we are all bringing our own unique selves and our social locations, our experiences to these, you know, to this particular debriefing or to other experiences. But, you know, hopefully we all see that as enriching. The discussion is going to be guided by the 6 steps of the input model. So there is a format, right? So we are going to work through it in that way. And the session is taking place in this sort of intimate group and sharing circle. So people have asked me in other sessions, are there a certain number of people that should be there, a minimum, a maximum? I don't know, Mary Lou, Val, you might have a more concrete suggestion. I always say no. I'm like, as far as I understand, you know, it's whoever comes. And I think that's wonderful, right? And maybe it's a small group to start, and maybe the momentum builds, right? When other people hear that this has been a beneficial process, maybe other people will start to come too. So if there are no questions, I'm going to get into the 6 different steps. Is there anything happening in the chat box that I should be?
No, just somebody thinks this is great.
Okay, excellent. Okay, so let's take a look at the first step. So the first step when you first meet in the sharing circle is an introduction. So the peer facilitator will basically name the experience, what's brought everyone together today. So it might something be like, you know, we're having the sharing circle, this debriefing circle today because Mary died yesterday. And I know that could be really hard. That could be really difficult for many of you. She'd been in the home for 15 years. A lot of us, you know, have known her for a while. And, you know, for team members who just had the chance to meet her, you know, we know that you may have had really close connection with her too. So we're here. We'd like to check in and see if there are things that are coming up, see how everyone's doing. And we appreciate that you've taken this time. So pretty simple, right? Just an introduction, naming the experience and checking in. The second step is need to say. So that's really an opportunity to ask participants if they have anything that's burning in their mind at the moment, right? So they may have questions surrounding what happened, how Mary died, how things were handled. They might want to take the opportunity to share some, you know, funny stories or memorable moments or thoughts about Mary and experiences they may have had. So this is really, what do people have like happening for them that they really need to share? What? So again, going around the circle, not putting any pressure on anyone, but inviting people to share what really is at the forefront of their minds with this experience. The next step, so the third step is need to do, and this is short-term planning. So you could start this step by reinforcing that there's nothing more that needs to happen right now. The event has passed. You know, it was really, you know, depending on the circumstances, you might want to share. It was really challenging, or, you know, parts of it that were difficult. But right now, we're really going to focus on what you need to do to get through this shift. You know, so it's the short-term planning. What do you need to get through today, maybe tomorrow? We're not looking into the, you know, way off future, but just in the next, you know, the next hours or days, what do you need to do to care for yourself in the grief that you're feeling in this moment, right? So I'm thinking about, I participated in a few of these peer debriefing circles, not in long-term care, but in group homes. And I really appreciated hearing, you know, the diversity of what people were needing in the moment, right? So in this particular situation, I'm thinking of a couple of the team members shared that they were feeling angry about how some of the circumstances surrounding the death, and they were feeling angry, and they just needed to go they needed to go outside and do something physical, right? Go burn off some of that energy, go for a run, go for you know, I sometimes hear from other people, in the need to do section that they need to have a bit of a cry, right? That they need to feel supported by colleagues. So just really like, what is that you need? Do you need to get some fresh air? Do you need to, the other thing that comes up, and I know this is a little bit different in long-term care, but what I've noticed in this is the room, right? Because a residence room in long-term care is supposed to be cleaned out within 24 hours. So I've noticed that this tends to come up, right? So what do you need to do to be able to make that a little bit easier, especially when team members are struggling with that? So just some ideas of what to talk to. And again, there's no right or wrong in what comes up in any of these sections. These are just these are some guidelines for what might come up. The planning section is also about what do you need to do, but it's a bit longer term, right? So this, I think, goes back to what Mary Lou was discussing earlier, like maybe some of the customs and traditions that you may have in your home to support grief. So, you know, if you want to think about planning a memorial, or if you want to put together, you know, if you want to put together, I'm just trying to, of course, I'm blanking on some of the things that we hear that we need in the longer term, but, you know, placemats. I've heard, you know, some homes talk about they want to put placemats on the tables where the resident had sat, you know, as a way of honoring them for a certain period of time. Books, like pictures and books, and having a picture potentially in a lounge or a common space. So all of these things that happen over, you know, a bit of a longer time. What is the plan that will support you and the team collectively? So the individual team member and the larger collective in sort of working through and integrating the grief that you're experiencing from a particular death.
One thing that the staff did in the long-term care homes I worked with is they developed a sympathy card, and the staff members who had been closest to that resident, you know, wrote a short handwritten personal note, like a sentence or two. And they mailed that sympathy card to the family member, because something that hasn't come up but is real is that the attachment is not only to the resident, but very often to the family of the resident. So that's another loss, is the relationship with the family. So they often would send a card. And I noticed that it's become a bit more prevalent to actually have the celebration of life in the long-term care home, where that is like physically there's a space for that. And I think when that's the case, it's really lovely when the staff and the other residents can participate in that.
Agreed. Thanks, Mary Lou, for bringing that up. And you just reminded that came up in yesterday's session too, that some of the team members were sharing exactly that, how challenging it is, right, to experience the death of the person living in the home, but then also the rupture in the relationship with family members, how difficult it is for both, right, for the staff to not have that continued connection, and for the families to a place they may have been visiting and developing relationships for years is suddenly not part of their daily existence or weekly existence anymore. So yeah, so maybe planning for, you know, opportunities for connections still.
Yeah, Ruth says in the chat that when she worked at a day hospice, they had a memory wall dedicated to the people who had died, with pictures and stories created by the staff on the wall.
Lovely. Thank you for sharing that, Ruth. Yeah.
And also at a home that I worked at as well, the yearly memorial service was a well received opportunity for a family who were interested to come, and that gave that reconnection with the staff as well, right? So it was for families and residents, or staff, family and residents, absolutely. And just for reconnecting those bonds.
That's awesome. I love that. And it's one of the things that, like, in my work as a grief therapist, that I often think about is how do we maintain these relationships with people once their body is no longer here, right? What are the other ways that we could sort of continue to express that connection, right? So it made me think again of this group home that I was supporting, and the person in the home who had died loved balloons. And some of the team members, all the team members, were either getting a real or a temporary tattoo of a balloon, right? Just as a way to memorialize the person, which I thought was really lovely. So yeah, this section is really neat, right? To hear what comes up and what the team might, what might come up with is something that the team could do regularly, and then maybe some of the things that are more specific to particular people, right? The more the ones that are a little more, I guess, like that tattoo idea, right? It was specific to that resident. So the next section, so this is the 5th, is understanding impact. And this is really an opportunity to just sort of summarize what's coming up, to normalize the fact that people are grieving. To me, this is, a big piece around the disenfranchised grief, right? So recognizing that people are not alone in this suffering, not alone in this experience. It's an opportunity to reflect on the individual strengths, to remind people that they already kind of know what they're doing. Because, if that's coming up, that people are unsure of how to move through this, checking in, checking back, what have you done before when you experienced grief, seeing if they could come up with some things that have worked for them in the past and reinforce those, and working together, if there are particular plans. It's funny to use care plans, I guess, because in long-term care, that can mean many different things, but they're plans for their own care as team members, just to continue to focus on their well-being. So that could sound like, as the facilitator, this is just, a way to sort of wrap it up. So if I'm clear, here are some of the things that you're going to do to take care of yourself today and over the next few days, right? So this is preparing to sort of wrap up the debriefing. You're summarizing what's happened. You're normalizing the experience. You're focusing on internal strengths and the external strengths of the group. And then you've come to the end, which is the opportunity to thank everybody for taking the time, right, to be here, to share their experience, to contribute to a culture that is grief friendly, to take death and dying and death out of the shadows into the forefront, where people, where team members and where team members could really just start to care for themselves and one another. There's no way to do that if we're not having these conversations. There's also the opportunity to tell people if people are struggling, that as facilitators, you will spend a little bit of extra time. You will be there if anybody needs a little extra support one-on-one. And this next part, I sort of think transitions are really important. I've chatted with other people who feel like, that kind of helps to go from the peer debriefing circle before you go back into your respective roles, is to maybe have some sort of ending ritual or transition ritual. So I happen to love self-compassion practices. So this is one I often do as a transition, which is a hands on heart exercise, which is just placing your hands on your heart for, 20 seconds or so. Our bodies naturally release oxytocin. And maybe offering yourself something that you need. May I feel calm? May I feel loved? May I feel connected? Or it could sound something like, this is hard, I'll be okay. Just offering you something to yourself that will feel nourishing in the moment. So that's one suggestion. The other suggestion that some groups have tried is maybe sharing a poem. It could be the same poem each time. It could be a different poem, but just a way to sort of ease it back into work. So I think maybe I'll just ask if there are any particular questions about the INNPUT model at this point before Valerie shares her experience in actually working with it in her home.
I would just add that the development of the INNPUT model, as Tara said, was done with the long-term care home staff and the research team. But one of the members of our research team, Dr. Joanne Viss, was a specialist in post-traumatic stress counseling. And there's actually a lot of theory behind the steps that you do in post-traumatic stress counseling or debriefing. So, for example, immediately after the trauma, you just deal with, the short-term emotion, etc. So the way the structure of the INNPUT model has evolved is really based on based on post-traumatic stress theory and practice, and adapted to working, in a long-term care home environment around death. And we did evaluate it at the time, and there's a published article which I gave to Carl, which I think he's going to share with you afterwards.
Thanks, Mary Lou. So Val, I think it's up to you now.
Just have to unmute myself there. Thank you so much, Tara and Mary Lou. So I had the opportunity, I was working as a nurse in long-term care in one of the homes at the time that Mary Lou was conducting her research and the research project. So I had the privilege of being able to partake in some of the activities of the research project. And one of them in long-term care, and one of them was the peer-led debriefing. So I just wanted to take some time here to share some of the experiences and some of the value that I felt as a facilitator, as well as a colleague and staff member working in long-term care with facilitating the peer-led debriefings themselves. So the 3-item categories that I'll talk about here is the process, impact, as well as some sharing of information. I put pearls of wisdom, but it's always the sharing of knowledge and information that we can move forward with. So with regards to the process, Tara had mentioned several key items here that I'll reiterate that we found effective with the peer-led debriefing. So again, ideally having them 20 minutes. We tended to do them about 30 minutes just to provide that time, again, depending on how many people attended the sessions as well, right? And just keeping it short, but an ideal time to enable the staff to attend and to have as minimal interruption on of their workday. And we also made a point of planning the peer-led debriefing, informing the staff earlier enough in the shift that they were aware that they were going to be having the debriefing session, so again that they can plan their workday to enable them to attend. How we had structured it was we held the debriefings, the sessions at the end of shift, so that would enable, so it actually overlapped the oncoming shift, so it would enable the staff who were on shift as well as those coming on to attend if they wanted to, and find what works best for your team and for your home as to what the ideal time would be. And as mentioned, and it is important to and recommended to have an interdisciplinary team who attends and who are invited. In long-term care, it is the nursing staff, the registered nursing staff, the personal support workers, the resident counselors, social workers, pastoral spiritual care, management, housekeeping, dietary. All of these people need to be included because they all have had a positive impact and some impact and experience with residents. So we invite everyone to attend who are able to. With regards to the actual impact of peer-led debriefing and sessions, what we found and what I found is that, and in conversations with other facilitators and colleagues as well, is it really enabled us as a team to come together, to support one another, to support each other, and the grief of a resident death to share memories of the resident, some which some of us may not have known about. So we often learned something about the resident that was shared by a personal support worker or a spiritual care associate or life enrichment personnel or someone that we may not have known about. So it really helped to shine some light on that resident as an individual and person. It also helped to build team collaboration, as well as respect, support, and appreciation of one another for the different roles that we have, for the interactions, for the relationships that we all contribute as part of the team. It enabled us to talk about the residents' end of life experience, not their experience, but the end of life as we were engaged in it, as well as enable us to talk about and express if there was anything that we could do different the next time. We can't change what was done, but we can learn for the next time. And it also allowed the sharing of feelings. If there was frustration or anger or questions, as Tara had mentioned earlier, that staff may be feeling. And that's important to talk about as part of grief healing and support. It allowed us to acknowledge, as I mentioned, the contributions of the team of individuals. So a few sessions or a few debriefings that I was involved in are really prominent in my mind. Some people having such a close relationship and rapport with the resident or with the family members, and how you can see their presence and their calming demeanor just provided such a wonderful experience at end of life in the comfort and support that they provided. Another experience was the expression from a PSW to a nursing staff, in that I forget how it was, I think it was the explanations that the nurse had provided to the family really help provide that a sense of peace and calm to the family members. And that was something that one of the personnel support workers in the session had acknowledged and said, "Thank you for doing that. I really noticed that difference that it made to the family members at the time." So again, really acknowledging all of our contributions. It really enabled people to express their grief, to share the grief, to release, to shed a tear. Often what we would do is we would light a candle and put a lit candle in the center of the table around which we gathered, which again resembled the light of the resident that we were honoring and here to gather about today. And also, and as importantly, it got us to talk about and ask, what are you going to do to take care of yourself? As Tara mentioned, today, to help us get through the rest of the day, to help us get through the rest of our shift, but also to enable us to come back tomorrow and continue to do the important work that we do, but also the work that is hard that we're doing, especially when it encompasses and deals with residents who are dying. Some of the learnings from doing the peer-led debriefing, important to support staff to have the time to attend the debriefings. So Mary Lou, as you mentioned, the organizational support to recognize staff grief and the need for grief and bereavement and supportive practices to enable that. So it was fully supported by management to have the peer-led debriefing sessions. It's also important that we found to incorporate them on a routine, consistent basis. Typically, we held them on at the time of the same day that the resident passed away, so that we can provide that support before the end of shift and before the end of the day. And having it as a routine practice, also having multiple peer-led debrief facilitators, so it doesn't just fall on the shoulders of one person, and that it can enable peer-led debriefing sessions to occur on a weekend, on a night shift, any shift that it's required, so that we could do it in the moment when the time is needed. And yet, Mary Lou, as you mentioned in the chat box, it's so important that the manager needs to make a commitment to having this happen. Having multidisciplinary team members as facilitators gives different perspectives and support, right? So as nurses, we have PSWs as facilitators, our spiritual care associate. So again, that supportive, collaborative team approach as facilitators and different perspectives as well. Recognizing that some staff will prefer not to attend a debrief. As Tara had mentioned, people deal with grief individually and differently. Some may not feel comfortable, then want to share how they're feeling. So those might be the staff that will say, you know what, you guys go ahead, I'll cover the floor while you are having the session. And so everybody contributes in different ways as well. And it's important to, as a facilitator, or just as a fellow colleague and team member, to recognize those people who choose not to attend, to make a point of connecting with them one-on-one, to see that they're okay, and to ask, how are you doing? Is there anything you need? And what are you planning to do to take care of yourself as well? And also as a facilitator, it's important to be able to guide the conversation as needed, so it doesn't become a blame session or a negative experience, because that might deter others from attending as well. And one other pearl is just to really definitely encourage to try it. We don't know until we try the positive impact that it can have. I know in my current role with the Regional Health Care Program in Northwest Ontario here, that I also do some peer-led debriefing facilitator training with long-term care homes and supporting staff to try it. We use the INNPUT model, as Tara has provided here today, and that coaching and mentoring and support for really encouraging to adopt it, to try it, see what works for the home, try again, and build that supportive team practice of facilitators to adopt it. So that's part of my experiences. I hope it's been helpful for all of you, or for anybody that is interested as well.
That's been great to hear. Thank you, Val, for sharing your experience with it. And there was a comment in the chat box. I'm not sure who of us wants to answer, but it is a comment by Abigail sharing that they they had a situation today where a resident died, and a Catholic deacon wanted to say a prayer, but the resident was a Jehovah's Witness, and the situation was that they suggested that to the deacon that it wasn't appropriate, but the prayer was said anyway, and some of the staff are upset now because it felt, I hope I'm representing this okay, Abigail, I'm kind of paraphrasing, but the staff is feeling that that was an ethical dilemma, that it wasn't appropriate. So she's wondering how she could respond to the staff. So I don't know that that's, you know, that might come up, that might be something that comes up in a debriefing if you were to do a debriefing, but at the same time, my first thoughts, I'll share mine, and then maybe Mary Lou and Valerie will have some other ideas. But my first thought is, you know, Mary Lou alluded to this earlier, we can't go back, right? So one is recognizing this has happened and there is some discomfort around it, you know, and just acknowledging that discomfort. The second is, what can we learn from this? How can we do this differently, right? So yeah, I think this is the kind of thing, like, as we're doing more and more work in long-term care, but palliative, you know, palliative approaches to care and long-term care, my hope is that some of these conversations are coming up before a person dies, right? That people are having the opportunity, either themselves or their substitute decision makers, to express more of these wants and wishes and values, so that this comes up less. So Abigail, I'm sorry that this is happening, because I'm sure that feels uncomfortable. That is a difficult situation. But I think what I would say to the team is, you know, just acknowledge that, yeah, that doesn't feel, you know, there's a recognition that that's not likely what the person would have wanted. Let's not, you know, little self-compassion, right? We did the best we could. This happened. Let's be kind to ourselves and wonder about how we could do things, you know, how we could avoid this in the future. I don't know, Mary Lou, Val, if anybody wants to add anything else there.
Well, I think you've answered it really well, Terry, from the perspective of the staff and how they, can, manage their own kind of reaction and feelings about what happened. But, from a, kind of a more, I guess, organizational level, it seems to me that information about the individual person who's died's language and culture and wishes should be clearly available. And like, my question is, why was the deacon there? If the person who died was of Jehovah's Witness faith and would not have wanted that. So, I mean, that's not for the individual staff to be coping with at the time. But I would go back and ask the question, why was the deacon there? and how can we communicate or provide information about that person's wishes in a way that would prevent something inappropriate happening?
Yeah, and that's what Robert has indicated also, his comment in the chat as well, suggesting that staff feel free to explain the wishes of the resident to the pastoral care person for knowledge and awareness. Great. So I recognize that we are close to time here, and unfortunately doesn't provide too much time for asking or a conversation, but invite for you to even put in the chat that how do you envision, or do you envision this process might work for you in your home, and how? And as well as, are there any adaptations that would make the process smoother or more meaningful for your home, for your team, that you might consider? So feel free to quickly type into the chat there if you don't mind. We'd love to hear any responses and suggestions.
Yeah, and I was also going to say, feel free to reach out to us at the Champlain Hospice Palliative Care Program if you're in the region, or even if you're out and you want the INNPUT model infographic, or if you're in the region and you'd like some support in implementing the INNPUT model in your home, we are more than happy to support you in doing that.